In the late evening of October the 12th, 1875, at number 30 Clarendon Square in the Warwickshire spa town of Leamington, a baby boy was born. Named after his father, Edward Alexander Crowley was the firstborn son and future heir to Emily and Edward Crowley. Nobody, least of all his God-fearing parents, would have deduced that this child, who later changed his name to Alister Crowley, was to become infamously known in later life as the wickedest man in the world. However, if what has been written in later years can be believed, and there have been a mountain of books written by or about this man, legend has it that Edward Crowley, the child, was born with 4 hairs upon the center of his heart, curling from left to right in the form of a swastika, the mark of the beast. The child's father, Edward Crowley, came from a wealthy Quaker family. His father and the child's grandfather, another Edward, made his fortune as a brewer, establishing a number of public houses that sold Crowley ale.
Inheriting a fortune, my father had no need to earn an income, and instead became a self-appointed preacher of the Plymouth Brethren. They were a small separatist denomination that emphasized 3 beliefs: the literal truth of the scriptures, the exclusion of all priestly authority, everyone was equal in the Brethren, and the belief in the second coming. My father would travel on foot around Warwickshire, and later, when we moved to Redhill, the Surrey countryside, preaching that true Christianity could be found only among the Plymouth Brethren. I was often by his side during these wanderings.
But whilst his father was a lay preacher of the faith, it was Crowley's mother, Emily, that enforced the strict doctrine of the Brethren at home. Life in that household could hardly be described as frivolous. There was no Christmas, no gifts, no childhood books, not even any toys. From the age of 4, Crowley would be made to join the family and servants in the dining room for breakfast, where they would read aloud a chapter from the Bible, each person reciting a verse. The expectation of the second coming of Christ, set against the vigilant rejection of Satan, set the standards by which Crowley was raised. During these early years, he learned about the end of the world, the deliverance of the Plymouth Brethren, and about the wickedness of sinning. He also learned a great deal about death, something his father was obsessed by.
Preparations for a distant future, such as signing a lease or insuring one's life, might be held to imply lack of confidence in the promise of...
Crowley came to look upon his father as a role model. He became a Plymouth Brother, believing wholeheartedly that this was the only true faith, unable to conceive that anyone could be so foolish or indeed wicked enough to doubt it. As he grew older, his feelings began to wander, just as any young boy's imagination would. But then, Edward Crowley was not just any young boy. When he was 11, his father died of cancer of the tongue.
I had some respect, but little love for my father. And from the moment of his funeral, I entered a new phase of development, the main feature of which was non-conformity. My mother sent me to the Ebor School in Cambridge for sons of Plymouth Brethren, run by the Reverend Champney, where the main teaching instrument was the Bible, and the main instrument for correction was the birch. It was around this time that I began to rebel and fantasize about torture and blood, often imagining myself being hurt and in agony. Of course, just as any young boy, my vivid imagination also began to turn to the opposite sex. But in particular, I had visions of being degraded and suffering at the hands of wicked women.
Perhaps these abnormal fantasies stemmed from his strict upbringing by his mother, or from some deep resentment for his father's death. But they were to become stronger and more prolific as he grew older. Alister Crowley and other authors documented a number of anecdotes from his boyhood life, none so sinister as that about a cat. Crowley had been told that a cat had 9 lives. From this he reasoned that it must be near impossible to kill one. But whilst most young boys would imagine the consequences of such a conclusion, Crowley decided to act it out.
I caught a cat, and having administered a large dose of arsenic, I chloroformed it, hanged it above the gas jet, stabbed it, cut its throat, smashed its skull, and when it had been pretty thoroughly burnt, drowned it, and threw it out of the window so that the fall might remove the 9th life. The operation was successful. I was genuinely sorry for the animal. I simply forced myself to carry out the experiment in the interests of pure science, just as any young boy would.
The young Crowley grew to loathe the religious doctrines laid down at the Reverend Champney's special sex school almost as much as he hated the cruel headmaster. He still continued to study the Bible, but in particular, certain passages, especially those in the book of Revelation. He became drawn to reading about the false prophet, the scarlet woman and the beast. And then one day, he came to a disturbing conclusion.
Well, it was just after I had been chastised by the headmaster for attempting to corrupt one of the other boys who had visited my house during the school holidays. I can't remember how or what I had attempted to do. I was at that experimental age. But I remember it was around that time that I realized I had become obsessed and fascinated by those that were the enemies of heaven. My sympathies lay with them, and this fascination would remain with me for the rest of my life.
Details of the next few years of the young Crowley's life vary from biography to biography, but it was clear that there was no love lost between mother and son. The pious Emily Crowley was undoubtedly concerned over the ungodly behavior of her son, and would on many occasions call him a beast. The young Crowley reveled in this new accolade, and began to identify himself with the beast from the book of Revelation, whose number is the number of a man, 603 score 6, 666. His mother, on the other hand, believed in the literal truth of the Bible, and would not have used this term lightly. It is clear that however much she rejected it, she probably foresaw the destiny of her wayward son.
My mother actually believed that I was the Antichrist of the apocalypse. And yet, she also believed that her poor, lost, erring son might yet repent and be redeemed by the precious blood.
Just after his father's death in 1887, Emily moved the family from Red Hill to Thistlegrove in London to stay with her brother Tom Bond Bishop. Bishop did not believe the accusations made against Crowley by the Reverend Champney, and much to Crowley's delight, moved him away from the school. Bishop also recognized that the young Crowley's health was poor, and a doctor confirmed his fears when he diagnosed that Crowley would be unlikely to reach manhood. Bishop decided to keep the boy at home, and embarked upon employing a succession of private tutors over the next 2 years. He also resolved that the boy's recovery required plenty of open-air exercise, including fishing and mountain climbing. Again, this delighted Crowley. Crowley progressed rapidly in mathematics, English literature, Greek and Latin, and welcomed the freedom he had been granted in being able to read books which had previously been denied him. He became adept in poetry and developed a yearning to become a great poet. Among the tutors that emerged, one Archibald Douglas taught Crowley not only English and maths, however. He also introduced him to the vices of racing, billiards, betting, cards, and on a trip to Torquay with Douglas, he was also introduced to the vices of women. It was on this trip at the age of 15 when Crowley lost his virginity to a woman he met in the theatre.
The nightmare world of Christianity vanished at the dawn. The obsession of sin fell from my shoulders into a sea of oblivion. It was a period of boundless happiness for me.
Whilst being introduced to the sins of the flesh may have instigated a period of happiness for Crowley, it certainly had the reverse effect on his mother. No more so than when she discovered that whilst the family was away, Crowley had experimented further with a young parlour maid in his mother's bed. The maid was dismissed and put out on the streets, and according to Crowley, she changed her name and became a prostitute. He also claimed that she met a fateful demise at the hands of no other than Jack the Ripper. In later years, Alister Crowley would publish an article claiming that he had discovered the actual identity of Jack the Ripper, one Robert Donston, a black magician. Crowley claimed to a member of the press that he had in fact met with Donston prior to his death in 1912, and that Donston had given him 5 blood-soaked ties, corresponding to the 5 murders committed in Whitechapel. How much truth can be held in these claims is debatable. But one thing that can be claimed for sure is these were just 2 of the many sinister and strange coincidences that were to surround this iniquitous man for the rest of his life and beyond.
Well, after the business with the parlour maid, we sent him off to Malvern Public School. But after only 3 terms, he came home with claims of being the victim of sexual abominations from other boys. My sister Emily, of course, refused to send him back, and instead we found him a place at Tonbridge. He seemed happy there. He spent the summer fishing and climbing, and indeed he had regained his physical health. His moral well-being, however, was a different story. After being at Tonbridge for less than a year, he went on a trip to Glasgow and ended up contracting a sexual disease from a prostitute. Of course, in disgrace, he was asked to leave the school. We then sent to live with a brethren tutor in Eastbourne, where he attended day classes at the local school. This seemed more productive. In fact, his studies improved. He took up chess and excelled, winning many local championships. He had also become quite a proficient rock climber. One of his favourite spots was Beachy Head, where he spent many days and nights camping and climbing. I think it was in 1894 when he joined the Scottish Mountaineering Club and went on his first trip to the Alps.
In 1895, at the age of 20, the affluent Crowley went to Trinity College, Cambridge, to read moral sciences, taking rooms at number 16 St John Street. It was also at this time that he decided to change his name from Edward to Alister. He spent little time in the lecture halls and did most of his studying of English literature in his rooms, where he amassed a vast collection of books. He seldom ventured out of his rooms, other than to indulge in his love of chess. In his first year, he joined the University Chess Club, where he promptly triumphed over the club president. In the summer of 1895, he spent his vacation in the Alps, conquering a sole ascent of the Eiger. Crowley studied Russian and spent much of his vacation the following summer traveling through Europe and on to St. Petersburg, as well as his favorite sojourn in the Alps. In the winter holidays of his second year at Cambridge, Crowley visited Stockholm, and it was there on New Year's Eve 1897 that something happened to Alister Crowley that would set the course of his life forever. It was approaching midnight, and he was asleep in his hotel room.
I was asleep, and yet I was awake. But this wasn't a dream. I became astutely aware that I possessed a magical means of becoming conscious of something inside me. I could release a side to my nature that I didn't know existed. It was a painful, terrifying, and horrific experience, and yet, at the same time, it seemed to be the answer. It seemed so pure and spiritual. My path had been chosen. I did little else during my time at Cambridge. There was, of course, the liaison with Pollitt. But as a young man of some standing, I didn't want to be seen as a homosexual. I mean, look what had happened to Oscar Wilde a couple of years before. No, I didn't have time for emotional relationships. I would find a local prostitute to fuck every time I felt the urge. Usually about every 48 hours or so. It's much easier, you know. Why waste time chasing something when you can have it delivered to the back door every evening with the milk? The Stockholm experience had allowed me to discover what I wanted to spend my time on. I would be an adept at the secret arts, a magus, and through my own true will, I could guarantee immortality and control the secret forces of nature.
In his last year at Cambridge in 1898, Alister Crowley wanted ultimate achievement in 3 different aspects of his life: poetry, mountain climbing, and the search for spiritual truth. By coincidence, he was to form 3 long-lasting friendships that same year, which would mirror those aspirations. The first of these was with Gerald Festus Kelly. Both Crowley and Kelly had come from similar backgrounds. Supporting one another as emerging artists, Crowley often sent Kelly his poetry for comment, no doubt including the pornographic collection of poems White Stains, which he had self-published that same year. Crowley also claims to have enticed Kelly in later years to dabble in magical rituals. Sir Gerald Kelly went on to become one of Britain's leading portrait painters and one-time president of the British Royal Academy. The second of Crowley's new acquaintances was Oscar Eckenstein, an eminent mountain climber of some distinction. Both Crowley and Eckenstein shared a passion for the writings of the Victorian author and intrepid explorer, Sir Richard Burton. Eckenstein would later take an important role in Crowley's development as a skilled mountaineer. The third friendship struck that year involved Crowley's spiritual enlightenment when, after leaving university, he was introduced to a man by the name of George Cecil Jones. Jones was a chemist whom Crowley discovered used his knowledge of alchemy to further his studies of magic and the occult. Crowley would become a regular guest of Jones at his house in Basingstoke, where he would receive his first lessons in magical practice. Within a few weeks, Jones decided to confide in Crowley and disclosed that he was, in fact, a member of a magical society called the Golden Dawn. A meeting was set for Crowley to be introduced into the society.
I was taken along to the Mark Mason's Hall in Great Queen Street, which was used for the outer order ceremonies. Membership of the club cost 10 shillings a year. There were a number of members I recognized: Florence Farr, the actress, Arthur Machen, the novelist, and William Yeats, the poet. Then, on the 18th of November, 1898, I officially entered into the order and accepted all its vows and obligations.
Child of Earth, arise and enter into the path of darkness.
Child of Earth, unpurified and unconsecrated, thou canst not enter our sacred hall.
Child of Earth, wherefore hadst thou come to request admission to this order?
My soul is wandering in the darkness, seeking for the light of occult knowledge, and I believe that in this order, the light of that knowledge may be obtained.
Are you willing, in the presence of this assembly, to take a great and solemn obligation to keep inviolate the secrets and mysteries of our order?
I am.
Kneel. You vow to keep the order secret and to maintain kindly and benevolent relations with its members, and will prosecute with zeal the study of the occult sciences.
I vow to keep the order secret and maintain kindly and benevolent relations with its members, and will prosecute with zeal the study of the occult sciences.
Be warned that the penalty for breaking the oath is severe. A hostile current would be set in motion against you. It would cause you to fall slain or paralyzed, as if blasted by a lightning flash.
So help me, the Lord of the universe, and my own higher soul.
Child of darkness, long hast thou dwelt in darkness. Quit the night and seek the day.
I will endure to the end.
Thus was born in the Isis Urania Temple in Great Queen Street, Brother Perdurabo, a neophyte of the lowest degree of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Of course, I had no intention of remaining in the outer order of such an assembly of nonentities for very long. Admission to the second order was much more appealing to my nature.
He rapidly rose through the grades with ease. By December, he had passed the examination for invitation into the Zealoto grade, then over the next 2 months progressed to the Theoricus and Practicus grades. In May 1899, he became a Philosophus. Alistair desperately wanted an invitation into the Second Order, but there was a required 7-month period before that could take place. He would also need a special invitation from the Golden Dawn's mysterious leader, Samuel Liddell Mathers, and there was something about Crowley that made Mathers cautious. As well as being a master Freemason, Mathers had spent many years translating one of the oldest and most famous books on magic, The Key of Solomon. He had also written a book, The Kabbalah Revealed, which he had translated from the Jewish Zohar.
Many years ago, I discovered another Hebrew manuscript, the book of the sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage. It was a kind of teach-yourself guide on how to impose your will on nature, using contemplation, prayer, and abstinence. Not that far away from yoga. There are 2 schools of magic. On the one hand, you have white magic, which invokes the forces of good. On the other hand, you have black magic, which invoke the forces of evil. Abramelin teaches that the good forces are superior in power to the evil or satanic forces, and that by prayer and leading a pure life, the practicing magician can call upon his guardian angel to help him use and harness the forces of the power of darkness. There are no real rituals, just lists of angels and demons which can be evoked. There are also talismans, which can be used for such things as bringing the dead back to life, obtaining riches, flying in the air. They can also be used for provoking desire in persons of the magician's choosing. Access to the second order of the Golden Dawn eventually led to access to one's guardian angel. I wasn't convinced that Alister Crowley could steer clear of temptation, or indeed that he knew where to draw the line between good and evil.
During the months of studying for the Golden Dawn, Crowley moved into new lodgings in numbers 67 and 69 Chancery Lane, London. He leased the rooms, claiming to be a Russian aristocrat under the guise of Count Vladimir Zverev. Mather's suspicions were not unfounded, for when Crowley decorated his new lodgings, he turned 2 of the rooms into temples. Both had magic circles and pentagrams on the floor. One large one, covered with huge mirrors for the practice of white magic, whilst the other, much smaller one, was kept empty, save for a figure of an ebony Negro on his hands, supporting a small altar on his feet and a human skeleton. This temple was for the practice of black magic. Brother Perdurabu would feed this skeleton with blood, small birds, and beef tea in an effort to bring it back to life. During one of the ceremonies of the Isis Urania temple, Crowley became aware of a powerful force. It appeared to radiate from a young man within the group. This man was Alan Bennett. Bennett was a highly revered member of the Second Order of the Golden Dawn, almost as highly esteemed as Mathers. And in addition, he had a formidable reputation as a magician.
I had heard of Brother Perdurabu, Alister Crowley, from Mathers, and had been asked to keep a watchful eye over him. I approached him after the ceremony and told him he had been meddling with the Gotia, the Dark Forces. He denied it, of course. In that case, I said, the Gotia has been meddling with you. He left the temple rather timidly, but the very next day, he arrived at my door. I shared a room in a rather shabby tenant building, and to my amazement, he offered me lodgings in his grand Chancery Lane apartment. In return, he wanted me to teach him all I knew about the occult. He was a very persuasive young man, so I accepted. I feel I should mention that I suffer from chronic asthma, and to keep it at bay, I would take regular alternate doses of morphine, opium, cocaine, and chloroform. Somewhat strapped for cash, I really had no other choice but to accept Alister's offer. I must add, I would never have accepted monetary rewards for my teachings. That would have been strictly against the Code of Honor.
Crowley had found what he had been searching for, a master in occult wisdom.
Within days of moving in, Crowley and I were performing and experimenting with magic ceremonies, calling upon demons and consecrating various talismans. Our experimentation into the occult went far beyond Crowley's formal Golden Dawn grades, incorporating the use of mind-altering drugs, opium, cocaine, and hashish.
In 1899, drugs of this nature were openly available for those that had the means to pay for them. The first Dangerous Drugs Act was not passed until much later in 1920, so it was quite legal and fashionable amongst many high society revelers to dabble in narcotics.
What wasn't legal in the Victorian era, however, was homosexuality, and Alister had been warned by a female acquaintance that his Chancery Lane apartment was being watched by the police. We did, how should I say, bend the rules a little. Alister and I were close, but never that close. Our relationship was based upon one another's devotion to understanding the occult and indulging ourselves in the affairs of magic. I was concerned, however, that he was becoming addicted to narcotics and was always searching and experimenting with his state of consciousness.
Rumors of the questionable occult activities in Chancery Lane were filtering back to the other eminent members of the Golden Dawn, as well as whisperings of Crowley's many promiscuous sexual relationships with both men and women. William Yeats, for one, highly disapproved of the man and let it be known to Mathers. In May 1899, Crowley went to Paris to meet the leader of the Golden Dawn for the first time. Mathers wanted to be assured of the obedience and harmony amongst the members in London. Crowley, on the other hand, wanted to be assured of his entrance into the Second Order. Despite Yeats' protestation, Mathers trusted the judgment of Bennett. Consequently, Crowley returned from Paris, feeling reassured that despite the claims made against him in London, entrance to the Second Order would soon be his. Bennett's health was deteriorating, brought on by the damp London air. He wanted to travel to the warmer climate of Ceylon to study Buddhism, but lacked the fare. Crowley could have paid it, but this would have broken the bond. Instead, he decided that he would perform a ritual to conjure up the spirit of Boer and ask him to supply the necessary funds. The very next day, Crowley received a letter from a married woman with whom he had been having an affair, but had ended the relationship.
Well, her name was Laura. She was married to a colonel posted in India. I'm not sure why, as she was a seductive siren who was seductive no longer. But I went to see her in her hotel. She begged me to come back to her and offered to do anything I asked. So I said, give me £100. I won't tell you whom it's for, except that it's not for myself. So she gave me the money. It paid Alan's passage to Ceylon, and so saved for humanity one of the most valuable lives of our generation. So much for Boer. I never did see her again, though I understand the matter of the £100 was later reported to the police as theft, probably by Colonel whatever his name was, although Laura refused to prosecute.
Whilst Alan Bennett left London for Ceylon, Alistair, Count Vladimir Zverev Crowley, had other plans. He intended to perform an intensive 6-month magical working, the Abramelin operation, and for this he needed a country house. Funds were not a problem, as he had by then inherited a small fortune from his father's estate. The precise details of the house are laid out in the Abramelin text. The house should be in a secluded spot. Within the house, a room should be set aside as an oratory, used exclusively for prayer and magic ritual. A door from this oratory must face north, outside of which should be a terrace, which is covered in fine sand from a riverbed. At the north end of the terrace, there should be a lodge where spirits both good and evil can be conjured, and those spirits can only be approached after the holy guardian angel has been evoked. Crowley found the perfect location near the village of Foyers, overlooking Loch Ness, and promptly purchased it. Boleskine. Alister Crowley certainly left his mark on this small Highland village. Many would talk of this strange man that had moved into the house in November 1899 and declared himself as the Laird of Boleskine. Crowley later wrote of his actions, declaring that he had evoked endless demons. the lodge and the terrace became infested with shadowy shapes. 111 servitors escaped from the lodge and entered the house, wreaking havoc. Those that visited or worked with Crowley did so at their peril. His housekeeper left, unable to stomach the sinister atmosphere of the house. His teetotal coachman suffered fits of delirium tremens, or the DTs, normally only found when an alcoholic abstains from alcohol, or a drug abuser withdrawing from drugs. One of his workmen went insane and tried to kill him. Even the accidental death of the local butcher was accredited to Crowley, having put a curse on him. However, a few weeks into the operation, something was bothering Crowley. He had been informed by Florence Farr that his request for admission to the Second Order was not going to be accepted. He immediately left Boleskine for Paris to visit and confront Mathers once again.
Brother Perdurabo arrived at my apartment in full Highland dress. Things were not going well with the Order back in London. There was unrest. And I was aware that my authority was being questioned by Yates and Florence Farr. I needed an ally, and Crowley was the ideal choice. I also needed his money, which he offered to put unconditionally at my disposal, if I granted him access to the Second Order. I carried out the initiation to the next grade myself. Alistair became, much to his delight, a full Adeptus Minor.
I went straight to the headquarters of the Second Order at number 36 Blythe Road to collect my documents for my new grade. But to my astonishment, they refused to give them to me, on the grounds that they did not accept Mather's initiation. There was mutiny in the camp. So, Mathers and I hatched a rather grand plan to seize back control. I would gain access to the rooms by persuading the landlord that I, the Laird of Boleskine, had the authority to enter, then simply change the locks. As the other members arrived, they would have to swear allegiance or be downgraded to the Outer Order. So, after watching the premises for a couple of days, my mistress at the time, Elaine Simpson, and I carried out the plan. It all went rather well. We arrived and simply took possession. Over the next few days, there were some comings and goings, other members demanding that we leave, including Yates. But I stood firm. That was until a constable arrived and we were ejected by the long arm of the law. My time with the Golden Dawn was over, and by all accounts, so was the Golden Dawn. I had heard that Mexico was an interesting place, so I packed a bag and set off for Mexico City.
Arriving alone, the impulsive Crowley rented a house in the center of the city overlooking the park, and promptly found himself a young Indian girl to take care of his needs.
I felt the need to get straight back into my magic, so I chose to experiment with making myself invisible by invoking the great god of silence, Harpocrates. By the great god Harpocrates, by your deep purple darkness, by my white and brilliant light do I conjure thee. Collect yourself about me. Clothe this astral form with a shroud of darkness. And so on. After a few weeks, it started to work. My reflection in the mirror grew weaker until one day I went out into the streets dressed in a scarlet cloak and a golden crown upon my head. I was invisible to all those that passed me by.
In his biography of Alister Crowley, author John Simmons noted that at this stage in Crowley's life, 3 aspects of his psychology had become clear. 1, he had no inhibitions whatsoever, throwing himself into any adventure that touched his fancy. The more horrible, the better, and he was not afraid of madness. Secondly, he needed some strong or horrific experience to be aroused. He would sleep with wrinkled and ugly whores for stimulation to write his poetry. And thirdly, he had no respect for his own or anyone else's body. His time in Mexico was not wasted. Based upon his own magic experiments, he duly appointed himself as Adeptus Major. He formed his own new magical society, the Lamp of Invisible Light. It had 2 members, one of which was Crowley. The second was Don Jesus Medina, one of the highest chiefs in Scottish Masonry, whom in return for membership of the LIL, initiated Crowley as the 33rd degree Mason in the Scottish Rite. Apart from magic and sex, Crowley also took up his other great love in Mexico, when he took off on a climbing expedition with his old friend Oscar Eckenstein to climb the mountains Popocatépetl and Wattle, both over 17,000 feet high. By the end of the year, Crowley decided to leave Mexico and traveled via San Francisco and Hawaii to Ceylon to meet his old friend and magical guru, Alan Bennett.
It had been a year or more since I had seen him. He told me of Beliskin and the demise of the Golden Dawn, and how he had progressed as Adeptus Major. We rented a bungalow up in the hills and spent the days meditating. He wanted to learn about yoga. After a few months, he had progressed to the level of dhyana, which he described as a spiritual experience, blending brilliance with meditation, with extreme violence. I felt I was ready with my own studies to enter a monastery, so we parted once again. I went off to Burma and Alister decided to go wandering around India. It was a few months later when we met again. He came to visit me at the monastery.
I remember it well. I knocked on the door of his bungalow and there was no reply. Then I noticed that his food was sitting outside on the window ledge. I tried the door and it was open, so I went in. There he was, about 5 feet off the ground, hovering weightless in the air.
One mountain that Crowley and his friend Eckenstein wanted to climb was K2 in the Himalayas, the second highest mountain in the world, and nobody had attempted to conquer it. Whilst Crowley had been spending time with Bennett, Eckenstein had been preparing for the attempt, and in March 1902, the assembled team met in Delhi. By the beginning of July, the team had reached 20,000 feet, but conditions were atrocious. Eckenstein had fallen ill with influenza, and Crowley was suffering from snow blindness. 2 of the group continued and managed to get to 22,000 feet, but by the 10th of July, the conditions worsened. A few days later, they decided to abandon the climb. This expedition was the first ever attempt on K2, and they'd lived for longer at the height of 20,000 feet than anyone else before. In October of 1902, Crowley left India for Paris to visit his old friend Gerald Kelly. He also intended to see Mathers to collect some items he had left with him for safekeeping. However, on arriving at the apartment, he was greeted by a stony silence, and Mathers refused to return the items. This was a meeting of 2 very similar minds, both deeply rooted in the occult, both wanting absolute power.
It was a question of who would strike first. As it happens, Mathers took the first blow. I don't mean fist fighting. We both had far more powerful means at our disposal. Mathers employed the services of an old woman, a female vampire. This woman invited me to tea on some pretext or other, and as she passed the milk, something peculiar came over me. I felt a strange, dreamy feeling, and something soft was touching my hand. I looked up, and she was standing above me. No longer an old woman, she had become a beautiful young girl. I recoiled my hand, but she came at me again, more beautiful than before. We were now battling for life. She tried to put her lips on mine, but I held her off. She was screaming obscenities like a banshee. I returned her own current of evil through my hands as I held her. A strange orb of light circled her head. Her hair turned white, her skin wrinkled, and her eyes became dull. She was the old crone once again. Cursing me, she left the room. I was now tiring of Paris, so I decided to return to Boleskine. Given the choice, under different circumstances, I would probably have fucked the ugly old woman.
Crowley spent the next few months at Boleskine, terrorizing the locals, experimenting with magic and writing his poetry. It was during this time that he completed his works, Snowdrops from a Curate's Garden. Gerald Kelly came to visit, which led to an opportune meeting for Crowley with Kelly's sister Rose. Rose was fascinated by Crowley, and he by her. Within a few days of meeting, Crowley had enticed Rose to marry him, and much to the anger of her brother, the marriage was performed in a civil ceremony in the town of Dingwall the very next morning. In the weeks that followed at Boleskine, to his surprise, Crowley discovered that he actually loved Rose. In the summer months, they traveled through France and then took a boat to Cairo.
In the beginning, I didn't really have much to do with Alister's magical dealings. Probably one of my first initiations into the occult took place on the night we were in the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, when I helped him invoke the ibis-headed god of knowledge, Thoth. From Cairo, we travelled into Ceylon and spent some time there. Our plan was to go on to Rangoon to visit Alister's friend Alan Bennett, but Alister had a change of heart. He told me that something in his subconscious was telling him to return to Egypt, which we did, and we did it in some style. Alister had grown tired of his persona and decided a new one would be more fitting with his newfound life. In Alister's normal fashion, he declared himself Prince Hiowa Khan and took to wearing a turban studded with diamonds, a silk robe, and a gold cloth coat. I was, of course, Princess Hiowa Khan. We would be driven around the streets of Cairo in our carriage, with two young men running in front, clearing our path. Oh yes, by then I was pregnant.
They took an apartment near to the Bulak Museum, where Crowley once more built his temple with the room facing north. By this time, Rose was heavily involved in all of Crowley's magic ceremonies. He called her Quada the Seeress, Quada being the Arabic for Rose. They engrossed themselves in the workings of the Abra Melon. Through one of the ceremonies, Crowley claimed to have received a message whilst invoking the falcon-headed Egyptian god Horus.
Therefore I say unto thee, Come thou forth and dwell in me, so that every spirit, whether of the firmament or the ether, or of the earth, on dry land or in the water, or whirling air or of rushing fire, and every spell and scourge of God the Vast One, may be thou, Abrahadabra. The greatest moment in my life was revealing itself. The operation was a success. The voice of Aiwas, one of the secret chiefs and my guardian angel, through Quada, was instructing me that a new dawn was coming for mankind and that I was the one chosen to initiate it. I was told by Quada to go into my temple on the 8th of April at 12 noon and to write down everything I heard. I followed my instruction.
Locked in his temple, Crowley wrote solidly for 1 hour. The same procedure was followed the next day, and again on the 3rd, until finally the message from Aiwas was complete. What he had written down would later become one of Crowley's most infamous works, known as the Book of the Law, the doctrine which the new order would follow, and Crowley himself would be the chief of that new order. The Beast 666 and his Scarlet Woman Rose. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, was probably the most famous line from this book. But there are also within the work prophecies and revelations which would leave even the most skeptic of minds wondering. And my number is 9 by the fools. My number is 11, as all their numbers who are of us. Hail, ye twin warriors about the pillars of the world, for your time is nigh at hand. For I have crushed an universe, and naught remains. Whoever disregards this does so at his own risk and peril. These are most dire.
Well, I was aware at the time that there existed a certain amount of prophecy in the words of Aiwas. After all, a new eon was coming. Horus epitomized force and fire. Undoubtedly, his new eon would manifest itself in a baptism of flames. The opening act of his reign would be to plunge the world into a catastrophic, bloody, and violent war. But I have to say, I didn't realize the significance of the book until some years later. I had the work translated by the assistant curator at the Bulak Museum on a stele of the priest Ankefen Konsu. The stele was exhibit number 666.
Crowley packed up his belongings in Cairo and returned to Boleskine, resuming the life of the laird, a Scottish nobleman, with his pregnant wife Rose. A few weeks later, she gave birth to a baby girl. Crowley, in his inimitable flamboyant style, named the child Nui Ma Ahatur Hecate Sappho Jezebel Lilith. Rumors amongst the locals were rife, some saying that Crowley was in the adjoining room when Rose gave birth, performing rituals, that the child may be born a monster. For the next few months, there was a sense of normality amongst the Crowley household. There were hunting parties and fishing trips, climbing expeditions. Crowley turned his time to writing more poetry, and during the winter, they holidayed in Samoritz, ice skating and skiing. For a while, Alister Crowley had become the proud father. By the spring of 1905, he was bored, and once again the challenge of a great mountaineering expedition beckoned. He still yearned to climb higher than any man had climbed before. This time it would be the 5 sacred peaks of Kanchenjunga in the Himalayas, and he would lead the expedition. His insistence on leading the party caused his old friend and climbing partner Oscar Eckenstein to decline.
The risk was too great. Alister was a great climber, but there was no way he could lead an expedition. He was too much of a loose cannon. I remember, on our last climb on K2, he actually pulled a gun and threatened to shoot Knowles. So, Alister, 3 Swiss mountaineers, and an Italian who had no experience of climbing at all. In fact, I believe he was a hotel manager that Alister had picked up along the way. They set off in the late summer with 7 tons of food and equipment, 230 porters, and 3 personal servants to make an ascent on Changchenchunga, the world's 3rd highest mountain at 28,150 feet.
The climb did not go well. About halfway up, 130 of the porters, fearing the god of the sacred peaks, refused to go any further. The climbers began to argue among themselves, the Swiss not liking the brutal way Crowley treated his porters. More of the porters suffered from snow blindness and mountain sickness. Others deserted, one of them falling to his death 1,500 feet below the group. Crowley refused to go and help retrieve the body. Morale was low, but worse was to follow. The group was hit by an avalanche. One of the Swiss mountaineers and 2 more porters were killed. Crowley abandoned the mountain and returned to Darjeeling without knowing if the rest of his colleagues were dead or alive.
The climb was destined to fail. I cannot lay blame on Alister for the tragic deaths on that attempt. When you're climbing a great mountain, you're completely in the hands of the environment. And accidents can happen. It's a dangerous business. Alister did cable an account of the attempt to the Daily Mail in London, but it was quite inaccurate, expressing his disappointment at the rest of the team and how he hoped to make another attempt the following year. But when I later asked him why he had left his friends, he confided in me. Kanchenjunga phobia. Alone, in the desolate conditions of the snow and the ice, he had heard voices, voices of the dead, and the voice of the demon of the 5 sacred peaks. And he said that for the first time in his life, he was afraid and fled.
Around his 30th birthday in 1905, Crowley meets up with his wife Rose and daughter Nui in Calcutta. They decide to embark on a journey to China. Having arrived at Bhamo by steamboat on the Irrawaddy, Crowley, Rose and their daughter set out on their journey. Rose and Nui carried in a chair by porters, and Alister walked ahead, across the breadth of China. 4 months later, their journey complete, they arrived at the seaport of Haiphong.
Alister had become very distant. The experience in the mountains had left its mark. He was tormented by his very existence. Sadly, as the days passed, he became more and more hostile towards me. Not as violent as he'd been with me in the past. I could tolerate that. But there was no longer any love for his wife and his child. The only thing that mattered to him was I was his guardian angel. By the end of our journey, I knew I'd eventually leave him.
At Hanoi, Crowley and Rose parted company. He left for Hong Kong to spend time with an old flame, Elaine Simpson. They spent the next 12 days performing magic incarnations before he traveled back to England via Vancouver and New York. Upon reaching Liverpool, he was greeted with a telegram. His daughter Nui had died of typhoid in Rangoon. Crowley showed little or no remorse for the death of his daughter, having abandoned them in China. Instead, he turned the blame towards Rose, claiming she had neglected to clean the child's feeding bottle and had exposed the child to the disease.
We reunited at Boleskine some months, where I remained for the next 2 years or so, a victim of his violent and vicious outburst. He even threw my mother down the stairs on one occasion. Alistair wanted me to continue helping him with his magic work, but I'd lost interest by then, which only made matters worse. He was a cruel man, bringing his mistresses home. He would sexually and sadistically abuse them, whilst I would be forced to watch. On occasion, they would be in our bed, whilst I would be hung by my ankles in the closet. Ironically, I gave birth once again during that period to a beautiful daughter. We named her Lola Zaza.
Between 1906 and 1909, Crowley met some new acquaintances as well as renewing old ones. He travelled to Tangier with one George Montague VII, Earl of Tankerville. They returned, the worst of enemies. An army captain by the name of Captain John Frederick Charles Fuller became a Crowley admirer and devotee, writing and publishing an appraisal of Crowley's work entitled A Star in the West. Fuller, in later years, would turn his admiration and devotion from Crowley onto another evil persona, Adolf Hitler. Crowley also took up again with George Cecil Jones, and they plotted together on the formation of a new magical world order, the Argentium Astrum, or AA. Whilst Crowley was undoubtedly a persuasive and fascinating character, he needed allies. Not only to satisfy his enormous ego, he also needed their money. The fortune inherited 10 years before was disappearing fast. Crowley took to enticing affluent young men into his new aeon, visiting his old haunts in Cambridge for likely candidates. Thus, in 1908, Victor Newburgh entered Alistair Crowley's twisted life. Victor Newburgh spent the first few weeks as a probationer with Crowley at his lodgings in Paris prior to his initiation into the AA.
In my mind, Alistair Crowley was a master. I'd read some of his works before I met him, and I was absolutely fascinated by the man. One thing I must ask, let this book be assiduously circulated among the young. Let me seduce the boys of England, and the oldsters may totter unconverted to their graves. Then these boys, becoming men, may bring about the new heaven and the new earth. You are not a Crowleyan till you can say, yes, thank you, God, I am an atheist. For the transvaluation of all values must yet again take place, when those are all dead and damned who have forced us into the painful position we now occupy. Young men, there is the enemy. I am no coward. I hope and believe that I may make a fairly good general, at least no traitor. But without an army I am useless. A Napoleon at St. Helena. During the month I spent in Paris with Alister, he became my sexual master, my guru, my teacher of all things esoteric. To further my education, we went on a walking tour of Spain and Morocco. And it was during this trip that he introduced me to the basic principles of conducting one's life through magic. Firstly, always remain a gentleman. And second, never take money for teaching magic. And never make a statement which you can't prove. And uphold the dignity of magic through the application of philosophy and science. And lastly, never pretend to be something you are not. Just before we parted company, I took a vow of holy obedience to be directed in magic by Crowley. In later years, I found this to be a very tough undertaking.
In early 1909, Alister Kроули read the just-published novel by Somerset Maugham, The Magician. He was immediately incensed. The main character in the book is modelled on no other than himself. Kроули had met with Maugham some 5 years previously. He responded by writing a scathing attack in Vanity Fair, accusing Maugham of plagiarism. This publication was edited by a friend of Crowley's, Frank Harris.
It was clear by then that my destiny was set. The public needed to know the truth. I would declare my new order on the world. I began production of a series of biannual publications, The Equinox. This would be the official voice of the AA, and the public would become aware of the new magical order.
In the summer of 1909, Victor Newberg came to Boleskine to continue his studies. Whilst going through some papers, Crowley found his manuscript of the Book of the Law, which he had scribed in Cairo some years before.
The year had started well. The Equinox was a success, and then finding the manuscript, it all seemed to make perfect sense. I was the chosen one. I would devote myself to the study of Thelema with my guardian angel Aiwas at my side.
It was an intense period of magical retirement. For the first 2 weeks, I was secluded in a room, alone, practicing yoga and fasting, reading, doing mantras. But at night, I would go to Alister's room. He had separate quarters from his wife, Rose. He was a cruel master, sadistic masochist. For the next 10 days, I spent the nights in a cold room, empty save for a gauze bed, as part of my initiation. The completion of my retirement, however, was wholly successful, and I became a neophyte of the AA.
Crowley's philandering had been taking its toll on the relationship with his wife, Rose. She had taken to drinking heavily and suffered deep bouts of depression. She agreed to a divorce on the grounds of adultery in return for a small financial settlement to their daughter Lola. 2 years later, Rose would be committed to spend the rest of her life in an asylum, certified insane. Meanwhile, Crowley and Newberg went off together to Algeria. During a long and arduous walk across the Sahara Desert, stopping off at oasis villages along the way, Crowley and Newberg embarked upon a series of Enochian magic rituals in order to invoke the 30 Aethers of spiritual being. Crowley once again changed his appearance to enhance his prominence by wearing a turban and growing a beard, and wore a large star sapphire ring. To complete the display of a great magician and gain the fear of the Muslim villagers, Crowley insisted Newberg shaved his head and at times took to walking him through the streets on a chain leash around his neck. Crowley later described these scenes in his book of Confessions, including one ritual which he termed as a rite of Pan. This involved an act of sex magic, in which Newberg took the active role. The concept of combining sadistic sex acts with his magic rituals was something in which Crowley would become infamously adept.
The 10th Aether was possibly the most dramatic ritual that Alister performed in the desert, when he evoked the wrath of the evil spirit Chronoson. We drew a triangle in the sand and slit the throats of 3 pigeons and placed them at the points of the triangle, their blood soaking into the sand. Alister and I then entered the triangle, he wearing a dark cape and hood. But it should have been I alone who went into the triangle to write down what I heard. Alister should have stayed within the safety of the magic circle. But he actually wanted to be possessed by Chronoson. What happened during the ritual was the most terrifying experience. I thought I was going to die. At one point, the demon threw me to the ground and tried to rip out my throat with razor-sharp fangs. I called on Awas for protection and swung the magical dagger. Chronoson slithered away from whence he'd come. When the operation was over.
The final 9 ethers were a little more relaxed. I had succeeded in attaining the grade of Magister Templi, Master of the Temple. As I wrote in a letter to Captain Fuller before returning to England, we had the apocalypse beaten to a frazzle. It was the holiday, holy day of my whole life.
When Crowley was about to publish his 3rd volume of the Equinox, Mather sought an injunction in the High Court to ban the publication, on the grounds that it contained excerpts from the rituals of the Golden Dawn. Crowley appealed against the injunction, and the case was found in his favor. The Equinox was published the very next day, along with a front-page story in the London Evening News, Secrets of the Golden Dawn. This was Crowley's very first success at notoriety. Another person also came into the picture around this time, a new member of the AA, Lila Waddle, a strikingly attractive Australian musician. Crowley and Waddle immediately became lovers. As a bizarre means of replenishing his depleting funds, Crowley decided on putting on a public display of rituals. The venue was Caxton Hall in Westminster. Newberg and he would perform the rites of Eleusis over 7 consecutive nights, with Lila Waddle playing the violin and charging an admission fee to the public. A reporter from the publication Looking Glass wrote a scathing review, citing the performance and lyrics as gibberish, and also mentioning Crowley's past acquaintances, including George Cecil Jones, as being involved with Crowley in unmentionable immoralities. Jones was furious and sued the publication. During the court hearing, Crowley, who was not called by either side, was described by the defending barrister as that loathsome and abominable creature. Jones lost his case based upon Crowley's evil reputation, and with it Crowley lost a number of benefactors who were helping to fund the Equinox and the AA, including Captain Fuller. Crowley decided it was time for him to bow out of leadership of the AA. Its purpose had come to an end. He would find a fresh organization for his new aeon. During the next few months, Crowley remained with Lila Waddle, despite her reticence to indulge too deeply into the beast's workings with the occult. There were, of course, the occasional affairs and homosexual activities. However, at the end of 1911, Crowley met a married woman by the name of Mary Dempsey and became instantly attracted to her powerful personality. Within a few weeks, they were consumed by an intensive affair, for Mary Dempsey did share Crowley's passion for the occult. He had found a successor to Rose as his Scarlet Woman. They took a trip to Switzerland, during which they performed a series of rituals, which resulted in Dempsey, in a series of drug-induced hysterical hallucinations, manifesting herself to Crowley as Abilditz. During these Abilditz workings, a transcript was taken by Crowley, which would later be published as Book 4. In this book, Crowley first used the ancient spelling magic to distinguish his work from those that he considered to be fraudsters. Following the trip to Switzerland, they decided to move on to Italy and find a villa to rent where they could continue the sex magic proceedings and continue the workings of Abilditz. The problem, however, was that Mary Dempsey had a 13-year-old son by the name of Preston. The boy was due to join her for the Christmas holidays. The relationship between Preston and his mother's lover was not harmonious, and the impression he made on the young boy only inflamed the tension. Crowley took to cutting his own arm with a knife whenever he broke his self-imposed conditions of mental discipline. Seeing this happen on a number of occasions, the boy later recalled in his autobiography, "My mother and I were lucky to escape with our lives. If I had been a little older, he, Crowley, might not have escaped with his." The boy was Preston Sturges, who grew up to be one of the most influential film directors in Hollywood. The affair predictably came to an end in May 1912. Crowley returned to London and, reunited with Lila Waddle, took residence at No. 2 Avenue Studios in Fulham. It was around this time that he came up against Theodore Roos of the German secret society, the Ordo Templi Orientis. Roos accused Crowley of revealing one of the OTO's greatest secrets and magical methods in his publication, The Book of Lies. The method in question was, in short, the use of sexual rites between two magicians to make the effect far more powerful. For Crowley, despite protesting his innocence, found this revelation far more interesting.
It instantly flashed upon me. The entire symbolism, not only of Freemasonry, but of many other traditions, blazed upon my spiritual vision. From that moment, the OTO assumed significant importance. I had found the vehicle for my new eon.
The highest magical grade of the 9th degree of the OTO is only given to those that have discovered the knowledge of the great secret themselves. Accordingly, both Crowley and Waddle were initiated. Crowley was also made Grand Master General of Ireland, Iona, and all the Britons. He also took on the new magical identity of Baphomet, a name for a blasphemous satanic idol taken from the ancient Templar traditions. His Book of the Law was to form part of the OTO ritual, and each member of the British Lodge was to possess a copy. Crowley would use his leadership of the British OTO to spread the word of Thelema. During the summer of 1913, Crowley and Waddle turned impresarios once again, this time in an even more bizarre venture than the shows at Caxton Hall. They took a team of dancing girls to Moscow. The troupe were called the Ragged Ragtime Girls.
It was, on the whole, a coarse, vulgar, sickening business, altogether new to me. My time spent in Moscow, however, was not entirely fruitless. I spent my days writing, and in fact produced some of my better-known work there, including the Gnostic Mass and the Hymn to Pan. There was, of course, a little deviation in the shape of a young Hungarian girl named Annie Ringler. Although we could not converse, I had forgotten my Russian and she spoke no English and very little German, we managed to communicate through the language of the flesh. She had a passion for pain, and I kept her happy almost every day by inflicting my own form of physical cruelty. It was certainly this period of excruciating pleasure which inspired me to write.
Bored with life as an impresario, Crowley abandoned the dance troupe in Moscow and returned to London. The Gnostic Mass, written during the trip, continues to this very day to be performed on a weekly basis by OTO groups around the world. This ceremony is performed primarily between the priest and a priestess, who should either be a virgin or have given herself solely to the service of the Great Order. The altar must face towards Boleskine. During the ritual, the priest parts the priestess's sacred veil with his sacred lance, and she removes her robe. The priest then embraces her knees. In Puritan countries, it is acceptable for the priestess to have replaced her robe before the embrace. Crowley, however, would prefer the priestess use no such modesty, and he also preferred to conduct the ceremony in private.
Alister was in his element. Not only did he have control of the OTO in Britain, he now had an excuse for using sexual magic and the introduction of bodily fluids to enhance magical power. We went to Paris for 7 weeks to perform 24 rituals. During the ritual sex, Alister would play the passive and I would play the active role. It was a marvellous experience. Alister, of course, was embarrassed by his homosexual cravings.
The supreme rite would be to bring about a climax in the death of a victim. By this rite, one could attain the summit of the magical art. Even better would be to slay a girl, preferably a willing victim. After violating her, she should be cut into 9 pieces, with the names of the appropriate gods written on the skin of each piece. The head should be burnt in honor of either Juno or Minerva. This supreme rite should not be performed on ordinary occasions, only rarely and to great purposes.
We talked about the supreme rite, but we concluded that it was probably black magic, and we never discussed it again. During one of the rituals, the 11th, I think, Alister remembered a previous life as a sate, a sacred prostitute at the time of Christ in southern Sicily. But the rituals were becoming ever more sadistic, and I started to have bad feelings. After all, I was funding the man's lifestyle and had been for some time. My mother told me that she had a letter from Alister demanding £500 if she ever wanted to see her son again. I didn't believe it. But in hindsight, I don't think I wanted to believe it. Eventually, the strain of the lifestyle began to wear on me, and I was in the early stages of having a nervous breakdown. So as we were leaving Paris for London, I plucked up the courage to tell Alister that I was bringing our association to an end, and we parted company. I have lived in fear of the beast ever since.
In 1914, war had broken out in Europe. Alister Crowley had contacted various departments of the British government requesting that they employ his services. After all, he did consider that the war was due to his rituals in Paris, and that the prophecy of the Book of Law had begun. The government declined his offer, which according to Crowley was due to his sinister reputation. He had decided to visit the USA, setting sail for New York on the ill-fated Lusitania. Hoping that the rental income and revenue from his publishing endeavors would support his new adventure, he left with £50 in cash and all his magical text and documents. He would remain in America for the next 5 years, and for the first time in his life, he would find himself without the funds to live his lavish lifestyle. Upon arrival in New York, Crowley discovered, much to his amusement, that his reputation had gone before him. This was due to an article being published in the World magazine, which described in lurid detail Crowley's satanic exploits with a number of aristocratic women at his Fulham studio. The article went on to describe Crowley as intensely magnetic. He attracts people or repels them with equal violence. Crowley had by then developed some outrageous habits, one of which he describes as the serpent's kiss. He had filed 2 of his teeth to points, and on meeting a woman, he would take her hand and bite her flesh, drawing blood in the process. Thus, he adds, infecting her with my power.
I continued my studies on the 9th degree, using a number of prostitutes for the purpose of magical assistance. I was also, in the course of my experimentation, sodomized by 2 strangers in a Turkish bathhouse, and performed a small favor for another. All done in the course of magical experimentation. I would rarely indulge in sex for mere pleasure.
During the first few months in New York, Crowley met by chance a German-American poet by the name of George Sylvester Wirek. Wirek was working for the German Office of Propaganda in America. Crowley, for some unknown reason, introduced himself as being of Irish descent, an Irishman opposed to British imperialism. As a result, Wirek, probably seeing Crowley as an eccentric oddball as well as a traitor, employed him. Crowley's first propaganda stunt was on the 3rd of July 1915, when he and Lila Waddell, who had followed him to America, stood at the foot of the Statue of Liberty and gave an anti-British speech. In the process, he pretended to tear up his British passport. Wirek employed Crowley to write for the German propaganda publication The Fatherland, and also to edit another publication, The International. Crowley, under the various titles of Alister Crowley, Baphomet, The Master Therian, and Lord Boleskine, filled the publication with anti-British nonsense and articles on magic. One article read, "For some reason or other, in their last Zeppelin raid on London, the Germans appear to have decided to make the damage as widespread as possible, instead of concentrating in one quarter. A house close to my lawyer's office in Chancery Lane was entirely destroyed. A great deal of damage was done at Croydon, especially at its suburb Addiscombe, where my aunt lives. Unfortunately, her house was not hit. Count Zeppelin is respectfully requested to try again. The exact address is Eaton Lodge, Outram Road." In another article, Crowley praised and urged the use of unrestricted German submarine warfare on Allied shipping. In England, the British government regarded these outbursts as treason and raided the London headquarters of the OTO.
It was an acquaintance, Frank Harris, that brought the accusations to my attention. The fools couldn't see what good I was doing. Look what happened to the Lusitania. This was my way of helping the Allies. Because of me, the Americans entered the war. I should have been given the Victoria Cross. Apart from the poverty and humiliation, I did achieve one accolade in America, however. Not from the British, American, or German governments. This was from a much more potent and higher order. I was initiated as a 9th degree magus. I also took up painting, which I became rather good at.
Crowley had placed an advertisement in a newspaper looking for models to paint. It read, "Wanted, dwarfs, hunchbacks, tattooed women, Harrison Fisher girls, freaks of all sorts, colored women, only if exceptionally ugly or deformed, to pose for artist. Apply by letter with a photograph." At the end of his phase in America, Crowley also met up with the next important woman in his life, Leah Hersig.
The first encounter? Yes, I remember it well. I was with my sister Alma and we called at Alister's studio. She had met him a few weeks previously at one of his lectures. Without any introduction, he immediately began kissing me and didn't stop for some time. My sister and I were of course surprised by this rather unusual way of greeting a total stranger, but I was even more surprised to find I was actually enjoying being embraced in this fashion by the master Therion. Alma was studying Alister's paintings, and while she and him were talking, he was taking off my clothes and began to sketch me. I remember he asked me, "What shall I paint you as?" To which I replied, "Paint me as a dead soul." The next day, I recall, I visited him again. He made me kneel in the middle of a magic circle painted on the floor whilst he performed the banishing ritual of the pentagram. Then, with an act of sex magic, he consecrated me as his Scarlet Woman.
Leah Hersig had a 2-year-old son, and during her subsequent relationship with Crowley in America, she fell pregnant. In 1920, Crowley was living in Paris and had asked Leah to join him. During the Atlantic crossing, Leah befriended Ninette Chamois, who also had a child, and was traveling to Europe to seek work as a nanny. Crowley thought it would be a good idea for a nanny to take care of Leah and her new child, and subsequently employed her. Within a couple of months of them arriving in Paris, Ninette also fell pregnant with Crowley's child. He now had 2 concubines, both pregnant, and 2 young boys in his care. He had decided to establish a temple to Thelema. For the location, he chose a small fishing village near Palermo on the island of Sicily, and it was here in this small villa overlooking the Mediterranean that he founded the Abbey of Thelema. The abbey is now totally deserted and has been left to rot in the elements. But it was in this ruin that the self-styled Great Beast 666, Alister Kроули, would earn his reputation as the wickedest man in the world.
Our daughter Poopy was born in Paris in February 1920. We moved to the Abbey shortly after. We signed the lease for the Abbey in joint names. He was Sir Alister de Courval, and I, the Countess Leah Harcourt. Ninette had become obsessed by Alister and jealous of me. I think she wanted him all to herself, but he was having none of it. Her pathetic ideals were well beneath the doctrine for Thelemites. Each morning we would put on our magical robes and take our magical weapons outside. He with his sword or dagger, and the women with their chalice. We would all face east and recite a short prayer, the Kabbalistic cross. Then at noon, in the evening, and at midnight, we would go outside and make our prayers to the sun. Most evenings we would perform acts of sex magic, usually between the 3 of us, sometimes with other assistants which Alister had found on the streets of Cefalù, or were visiting the Abbey. He was also taking heroin by then. Jane Wolfe, the actress, I recall her visiting around this time.
I found having 2 wives a problem. They grow insanely jealous of each other. Whereas with 3 wives, the problem is different. 2 of them compare notes while you're with the 3rd. 4 is the ideal number, because that makes a crowd, and a crowd can be neglected.
During the summer of 1920, the baby Poupée became ill. Over the next few months, her condition worsened. By October, she was taken to a hospital in Palermo, where on the 12th of October, Crowley's 45th birthday, she died.
Of course, it was a terrible time. I had fallen pregnant again, but sadly miscarried a few days after Poupée died. Alister had found some notes written by Nanette in her diary, in which he discovered she had committed acts of witchcraft against myself, our beautiful baby girl, and our unborn child. He was furious and physically sick at the same time. He went into the temple and performed an exorcism on the demons that worked her evil.
Crowley's exploits in the Abbey, of which he kept a magical record, became more and more bizarre, perhaps due to his heroin-fueled state of consciousness. His inhibitions about homosexuality had all but disappeared, and all potential Thelemites, both men and women, wishing to indulge were welcome. On occasions, he would paint his face in his words, like the lowest kind of whore, before indulging in sex magic and acts of sodomy. His finances, however, had become desperate. He'd gone through his father's, his mother's, and 3 aunts' inheritances. To find the solution to the problem, he sought guidance through the occult and promptly disappeared to Paris, leaving Léa in charge of the Abbey. For the next few weeks, searching for an answer to his problem, he performed his magic and gained a number of followers to his cause. On his return to Cefalù, he entered his temple and embarked upon the ultimate ritual a magus could perform. Deep in despair over his poverty, he would put his destiny in the hands of the gods. As he later recalled, if they willed him to live and to continue the great work, so be it. He would stand before them defiant and announce that he was the Ipsissimus. In ancient occult tradition, the Ipsissimus is the highest order.
Well, I survived. I am by insight and initiation an Ipsissimus, higher than the gods themselves, higher than the secret chiefs. There is nothing higher than the Ipsissimus.
In May 1922, Crowley and Leah Herzig travelled to London. Crowley had plans to raise some much-needed cash by selling his story in an autobiography. When the publishers turned down the book, Crowley offered them an alternative, a novel loosely based on his life, The Diary of a Drug Fiend. One publisher took up the offer and paid Crowley in advance. He delivered the manuscript a month later. In November 1922, with Crowley and Herzig back in Cephalo, the book was published.
Having reviewed the book, we ran a headline in the Sunday Express, a book for burning, and we urged the publishers, Collins, to withdraw it from sale. A week later, we followed up the story with a front-page photograph of a shaven-headed Crowley. And the headline was Orgies in Sicily, a black record of Alistair Crowley and his preying on the debased.
Crowley revelled in the publicity, in the belief that it would attract more paying disciples to Cephalo. It did attract one new disciple in particular, Raoul Loveday, a 23-year-old man who arrived at the Abbey on the 26th of November 1922 with his young wife Betty May. Raoul wanted to study under the great master. Betty was skeptical and unsure of living in such a bizarre household.
He had given us razors, which we were to use to cut ourselves. Under our arms, we were to use the word I. This was a word that only Crowley could use in the Abbey. But I was having none of it. Poor Raoul took everything with such a deadly seriousness. But he could not prevent himself from saying the word I. And he was so conscientious that he always wounded himself as a punishment. Until his whole body was covered in cuts.
By the January of 1923, having been in the Abbey for 2 months, Raoul became sick.
I believe his illness came from a combination of all the drugs that he had been taking. Crowley used to urge Raoul to experiment with large amounts of hashish. But there was the business of the cat's blood, which Raoul had consumed during a ritual. His fever got worse. So much so that after a week he couldn't move. I wanted to take him to hospital, but we had no money left and we were totally dependent on the Abbey for food and support, and the mystic had promised that the doctor would call, but he didn't. I wanted to contact the British consul in Palermo for help, but Raoul persuaded me not to, and Lee made me sign a letter. To say that I wouldn't contact any of the authorities. If I did, they said they would have thrown me out. A few days later, on the 16th of February, Raoul died.
Raoul Loveday's body was carried the next day from the abbey and buried just outside the walls of the town cemetery. The burial ceremony was conducted by Alister Kроули. Betty May finally managed to get away from the abbey, and on her return to England she was interviewed by the Sunday Express.
We had a fantastic headline. New sinister revelations of Alister Kроули. Varsity lad's death, citing Raoul and Betty May as Crowley's victims. We wrote, once they were in Sicily, they found that they had been trapped in an inferno, a maelstrom of filth and obscenity. A week later, we ran another story, the horror of the beast and his abbey. This man Kроули is the most sinister man of modern times. Hot on our heels, John Bull came out with a series of articles headlining Kроуli as the king of depravity, the wickedest man in the world, the man we would most like to hang, and one that sent a chill through Fleet Street, a cannibal at large. They printed an account of that Kроули on a Himalayan expedition had killed and eaten 2 of his native porters.
Alister Kроuli's reputation had been damaged beyond repair. On April the 23rd, 1923, the Commissario in Cefalù, following the instructions of Mussolini, handed Alister Kроуli an expulsion order. The Beast 666 and his Scarlet Woman departed Palermo on the 1st of May. The next few years of this man's astonishing life can best be described as his wilderness years, although he preferred the term living in exile. Now completely addicted to heroin, he wandered between North Africa, France, and London. And wherever he went, his evil reputation and his heinous tendency for experimenting in sex magic closely followed. He had become a universal figure of hate. As for the other Thelemites from the abbey, their lives disintegrated. The Scarlet Woman, Leah Herzig, left her son behind at Cefalù in the care of Ninette, who had been accepted back by Kроули before his expulsion. Leah's sister Alma took the boy back to America. As for Leah, living on the streets of Paris, a hopeless addict, penniless and selling her body for food, she eventually denounced Kроули. Leah returned to America and lived the rest of her life as a devout Roman Catholic. By 1924, Kроули was living in poverty in France. An old friend and famous literary figure and occultist, Frank Harris, kindly took him under his roof. Frank Harris lived with a woman by the name of Nellie O'Hara. If what has been written in later years can be believed, Nellie had a friend in America, Pauline Pierce, who was married to Marvin Pierce, head of the McCall Corporation. In early 1924, Pauline traveled to France to stay with her friend. Thus it was that 4 individuals came together: Frank Harris, Nellie O'Hara, Pauline Pierce, and Alister Kроули. According to Kроuli's diaries, during this period in Paris, Kроули underwent the supreme ordeal, linked with his realization of the grade of ipsissimus. According to a description of the rite, on the appointed day, the candidate is attended by one or more chosen and experienced attendants whose duty is A, to exhaust him sexually by every known means, B, to rouse him sexually by every known means. Every device and artifice of the courtesan is to be employed, and every stimulant known to the physician. If Crowley did go through this ordeal in 1924, then it is highly likely, based on his previous experiences, that his closest associates of that time, including Nellie and Pauline, performed as his magical assistants. Pauline Pierce returned to America in early October of 1924. 8 months later, on June the 8th, 1925, she gave birth to a girl named Barbara. Barbara Pierce married George H.W. Bush, who eventually became the 41st President of the United States. And they had a son, George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. Could the wickedest man in the world, Alistair Crowley, be George W. Bush's grandfather? In 1925, Crowley received a letter from Theodor Roos of the OTO in Germany. A vacancy had become available for international head of the OTO. They had chosen Baphomet.
To the British, and indeed the Americans, I may have been a flesh-eating devil, but the Germans obviously still appreciated the lore of Thelema. I was still Baphomet, an ipsissimus, the great beast, 666.
Crowley spent the next couple of years living in Paris, his fortunes improving as new disciples donated to the cause. His apartment was funded by benefactors of the OTO. Probably the most significant of these new disciples was Israel Regardie. Regardie would live to become one of the most significant occultists of the 20th century. He arrived in Paris on the 12th of October 1928, Crowley's 53rd birthday. On meeting Crowley, he was persuaded to hand over his entire life savings.
I had dinner with the old man and his mistress. No sooner had we finished eating when they got on the floor and started fucking. Later he asked me, "Got any money on you, Regardie?" Like a fool, I gave him all my cash. Never did see it again. I was probably repaid 1,000-fold in knowledge, though. Mind you, I must say, later on, when I was broke, he did help me out financially. He even sent me to his tailor to get a suit made. I don't think he ever did pay the bill. In return for the old man being my magical mentor, I worked for him as a private secretary. It was later that year that his book, Magic in Theory and Practice, was published. This was the first publication of a new book on magical workings for centuries.
This was a joyous time for Crowley. Not only did he have a new book and a continuous flow of finances, he also had a new Scarlet Woman, Maria de Miramar. But a visit from an inspector of the Prefecture of Police would dampen his spirits. His infamy had once again caught up with him. Alistair Crowley, Maria de Miramar, and Israel Regardie were given 24 hours to leave the country or face imprisonment.
He wanted to stay in Paris to bask in the publicity surrounding the publication of his new book. So the cunning old fox packed me and Maria off to England, while he found a doctor to give him a certificate declaring him unfit to travel. Things weren't going too well between Crowley and Maria. They were fighting all the time. She complained that she was fed up with him beating her and always trying to give her one up, though You know, sodomize her. I guess that's why we ended up having sex together. She wanted to punish him. She was a fiery woman. I did confess this to him later on, but he didn't seem to mind. In fact, he thanked me for keeping her content. He married her a few months later.
After a year of living together in London, during which he published his next book, Confessions, Crowley went to Germany, leaving Maria behind. With no means to support herself and receiving none from her husband, she fell into dire straits and ended up in the public workhouse. By 1931, having attempted suicide, she was committed to an asylum in New Southgate, where she remained until she died 30 years later. Leaving a trail of unpaid debts in Berlin and a 19-year-old mistress that had committed suicide, Crowley came back to London in 1932 and leased new lodgings at number 27 Albemarle Street.
We began to drift apart. I wanted to work on independent studies, especially those on the traditions of the Golden Dawn. I don't think he had one trusted disciple left in England. People were beginning to desert the great master. He wanted to gain public respectability, wining and dining with socialites at the Café Royal. There was Christina Foyle of the famous Foyle's bookstore. She invited him to be guest of honor at their literary luncheon at Grosvenor House, to speak on the philosophy of magic. He befriended Nancy Cunard, the wealthy shipping heiress. I think he wanted them to pay his bills and to finance his lifestyle. Most of them ran a mile when they discovered his motives, and even more so when they found out about the old man's sexual preferences.
Some years previously, Alister Crowley had been briefly acquainted with Nina Hamnet, the acclaimed model and painter. In 1932, she published her memoirs, Laughing Torso, in which she included a great deal about her time spent with Crowley and Victor Newburgh. She insinuated in the biography that Crowley performed black magic at the Abbey, and also that a baby had mysteriously disappeared. Crowley was furious and issued court proceedings against Hamnet and her publisher to cease and desist from publication on the grounds of libel. The trial commenced on April the 9th, 1934.
I was called as the first witness and was questioned by my own counsel. He asked me if I called myself the Beast 666 and the Master Therium. I answered yes to both. What does Therium mean? He asked. To which I replied, Great Wild Beast. He then asked the question, do these titles convey a fair expression of your practice and outlook on life? The Beast 666 only means sunlight. You can call me Little Sunshine, to which there was a roar of laughter throughout the court.
The trial lasted 4 days, at the end of which the judge, Mr. Justice Swift, gave the following summing up to the jury. I've been over 40 years engaged in the administration of law in one capacity or another. I thought I knew every conceivable form of wickedness. I thought that everything which was vicious and bad had been produced at some time or another before me. I've learnt in this case that we can always learn something more if we live long enough. I've never heard such dreadful and horrible, blasphemous and abominable stuff as that which has been produced by a man who describes himself to you as the greatest living poet.
As you can imagine, I lost the case. I couldn't pay the costs, and as a result, I ended up bankrupt. they took everything. But at least my name was scrawled across the tabloids. The world knew I still existed.
It has been documented in various biographies that Alister Crowley offered his services during World War II. In others, there are claims that he knew Winston Churchill, and it was he who gave Winston his famous V for Victory sign. Other historians claim that he actually worked as a spy in pre-war Germany. Crowley himself claimed that he was responsible in part for Hitler's Mein Kampf, claiming that he had sent a copy of the Book of the Law to Hitler in the early 1920s, and that he had been greatly influenced by the Law of Thelema. He also claimed that the Nazi symbol of the swastika came from him. Whilst none of these claims can be verified, there was a plan to recruit his services by the Department of Naval Intelligence. Ian Fleming, the famous writer, was involved with many top-secret operations during World War II, including the plan which lured Rudolf Hess to England by slipping him false astrological information. They believed that Rudolf Hess was the gullible Nazi leader they were looking for, and it proved true. During the interrogation, Rudolf Hess spoke in strange ramblings which some viewed as occult. Ian Fleming, who was involved with these interrogations, decided that help was needed. He suggested to his boss that Crowley should be allowed to interview Hess about the role of the occult in Nazism. In the end, Crowley was never summoned. In 1942, a man by the name of Jack Parsons took over the California branch of the OTO, the Agape Lodge. They had been sending money to Crowley to support his cause. Jack Parsons was an eminent rocket scientist. He had written to Crowley about a new member who had become a disciple and with whom he had been performing rites of sex magic. His name was Lafayette Ron Hubbard. Hubbard remained a member of the lodge for 2 years, until he ran off with one of the priestesses. Lafayette Ron Hubbard went on to found the Church of Scientology. He later claimed to have infiltrated the Church of Thelema to break up black magic in America, and in the process rescued a girl they were using. In 1945, after a brief spell at the Bell Inn in Aston Clinton, Buckinghamshire, Alister Crowley moved to his final lodgings, Netherwood, a boarding house in Hastings. In poor health, the wickedest man in the world was in his twilight years. His lifelong excesses had finally exhausted him. He was a wasted heroin addict, given to doubts and rages. During the night, on the 1st of December 1947, at the age of 72, he died, uttering his final words, "I am perplexed." On the 5th of December, 1947, on a cold grey afternoon, in a non-denominational chapel at a funeral home in Brighton, the beast was cremated. During the service, his hymn to Pan was read out loud, along with excerpts from the Gnostic Mass. I rave and I rape and I rip and I rend, everlasting world without end. Amongst the headlines that appeared the next day was, Farewell 666.